The woods were silent, save for the rustling of leaves beneath Daniel's boots. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying wood. He gripped the frayed leash in his hand, his knuckles whitening as he hesitated. The dog at his side, a frail, aging Labrador named Baxter, wagged its tail blindly, unaware of the betrayal about to unfold. Daniel swallowed hard. This wasn't easy, but he had convinced himself it was necessary. Baxter had been part of his life for over a decade, but his blindness had made him a burden. The vet bills, the constant care. Daniel was tired. "It's better this way," he murmured, more to himself than to the dog. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the forest floor. Daniel led Baxter deeper into the woods, past the dirt path, past the fallen log he had marked in his head as a point of no return. He stopped near a clearing, his breath shaky. "This is it, buddy," he whispered, kneeling beside the dog. Baxter nuzzled his face into Daniel's hand, trusting, loving, unaware. Daniel yanked the collar over Baxter's head, tossing it aside as if it would absolve him of guilt. He stepped back, watching as Baxter sniffed the air, confused. "Go on," he urged, his voice breaking. "You'll be fine." Baxter took a tentative step forward, then another. The dog turned its head in Daniel's direction, ears perked as if listening for reassurance. But Daniel didn't speak. He turned and walked away. Faster. Faster. His heart pounded as the sound of his own footsteps filled the silence. He didn't look back. He couldn't. By the time he reached his car parked at the side of the road, his hands were shaking. He fumbled with his keys, his vision blurring with unshed tears. As he slid into the driver's seat, he forced himself to take deep breaths. It was done. It had to be done. But something felt wrong. As he started the car and pulled onto the road, the trees seemed darker, looming, watching. The wind whispered through the branches, an eerie sound that made his skin crawl. He shook it off. Just nerves, he told himself. Guilt playing tricks on his mind. The drive home was long, the highway stretching endlessly under the dimming sky. But the further he got from the forest, the heavier the air around him became. Then came the first sign, a movement in the rearview mirror. Daniel's breath hitched as he caught a flicker of something pale and shifting in the back seat. His grip on the wheel tightened, his pulse roaring in his ears. He forced himself to glance over his shoulder. Nothing. Just an empty backseat. He exhaled sharply. Calm down. But the unease didn't fade. He kept his eyes on the road, but the feeling persisted, that sensation of not being alone. Then the radio crackled to life. Static. Sharp, piercing, filling the small space of the car. Daniel twisted the knob, but the noise only grew louder. Then, beneath the static, a sound. A low, wheezing breath. His fingers went numb as he yanked the radio off. Silence returned, but the weight in the car did not lift. He drove faster. The streetlights of his neighborhood were a welcome sight. He pulled into his driveway, cutting the engine. The moment he stepped out, a cold breeze rushed past him, carrying a sound, a soft shuffle of movement just behind him. He spun around. Nothing. The street was empty. The night was still. Daniel exhaled and shook his head. He was losing it. Guilt was messing with his mind. He needed sleep. He needed to forget. But as he stepped toward his front door, the unmistakable sound of nails scratching against pavement made his blood run cold. Slow. Deliberate. Right behind him. Daniel turned again, heart hammering. But the street was still empty. No Baxter. No stray dog. No one. Swallowing the lump in his throat, he hurried inside, slamming the door shut and locking it. His home felt safe, warm, familiar. He let out a breath, pressing his back against the door. Then the scratching started again. This time from the other side of the door. A slow, scraping sound, like claws dragging against the wood. Daniel's blood froze. He reached for the peephole, hesitant, breath shallow. He peered through. The porch was empty. But just as he exhaled in relief, his gaze flickered downward, and his stomach dropped. There, just beyond the doorstep, were fresh, muddy paw prints, leading straight to his door. And nothing else. Daniel stood frozen at the door, staring at the paw prints that led to his doorstep. His mind scrambled for a rational explanation. Maybe Baxter had somehow followed him home? But that was impossible. The forest was miles away, and the dog was blind. His throat tightened as he reached for the doorknob, hesitating before twisting the lock back open. The door creaked as it swung outward. The porch light buzzed above him, casting long shadows across the empty street. There was nothing there, just the paw prints, deep, damp, and ending abruptly at his doorstep. No sign of movement. No sign of a dog. A shiver crawled down his spine as he quickly shut the door again, locking it tight. He was imagining things. That's all. Still, the weight of unease pressed against his chest. He turned away from the door, forcing himself to breathe. His house was quiet, too quiet. The silence pressed in, thick and suffocating. Then, a sound. Click, click, click. Daniel's breath hitched. It was coming from the hallway. Footsteps. Or paw steps. Slow. Deliberate. He turned his head sharply toward the sound, heart hammering in his chest. The hallway was dark, stretching into a void of shadows. He reached for the light switch, fingers trembling as he flicked it on. Nothing. Just an empty hall leading to his bedroom. Daniel exhaled shakily, rubbing his face. "I need sleep," he muttered. His nerves were shot, his mind playing tricks on him. He moved to the kitchen, grabbing a glass from the cabinet with unsteady hands. The tap water was ice cold as he filled the glass, his throat parched. He took a sip, savoring the brief moment of normalcy. Then, from the corner of his eye, movement. Daniel's grip on the glass tightened. He turned his head toward the window above the sink, where his own reflection stared back at him in the dim kitchen light. But he wasn't alone. Behind him, in the reflection, something was there. A shape. Pale. Twisted. Hunched. It loomed in the darkened hallway, just beyond the threshold of the kitchen. Its form was wrong, as if its limbs had been stretched too far, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Daniel's pulse pounded in his ears. His breath hitched in his throat. He didn't want to turn around. The reflection remained still, watching. Then a sound. A low, rattling wheeze. Right behind him. Daniel whipped around. Nothing. The hallway was empty. No shape. No figure. His breath came in short gasps as he staggered back against the counter. His hands gripped the edge, knuckles white. He was losing it. He had to be. But as he turned back to the window, his stomach dropped. The reflection had not changed. The thing was still standing there in the glass, watching him, waiting. Daniel's body locked in place. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe. His mind screamed for him to run, but his legs refused to obey. Then, the light above him flickered. A flash of darkness, a blink, and the reflection was gone. The kitchen plunged into suffocating silence. Daniel's skin crawled. He staggered away from the window, backing toward the hallway. His entire body screamed for him to leave, to get out of the house. Then he heard it again, the scratching. This time inside. It came from the bedroom. Daniel's breath came in shallow gasps. He turned toward the closed door at the end of the hallway. The sound continued, soft but insistent, nails dragging across wood. His stomach clenched. He had locked that door before leaving for the forest. No one else was here. Then a low whimper. His blood turned to ice. It sounded like Baxter. But it couldn't be. Daniel took a step forward, heart hammering. Another whimper, soft and pained. His fingers twitched as he reached for the doorknob, the air growing thick, suffocating. He swallowed hard and turned the handle. The door creaked open. Darkness greeted him, swallowing the room in a thick void. The only light came from the dim glow of the street lamp outside, casting eerie shadows across the floor. His breath caught in his throat. There, in the middle of the room, something was sitting. A shape, hunched and still. Daniel's pulse roared in his ears as he took a step closer. His eyes adjusted to the dark. His stomach twisted. It was Baxter. The old dog sat there unmoving, his head tilted slightly, as if listening. But something was wrong. Baxter's fur was damp, matted with something dark. His body was too still, too rigid. His head was slightly twisted, his blind eyes fixed on nothing. Daniel's breath hitched. Baxter? Then, the dog's mouth slowly opened. And a voice, not a bark, not a growl, but something cold, hollow, human, whispered. You left me. The lights flickered, and everything went black. Darkness swallowed Daniel whole. The moment the lights flickered out, a suffocating silence filled the room. He couldn't see, couldn't move. His breath came in short, shallow gasps as he strained to listen. The whisper still echoed in his mind. You left me. His fingers trembled as he fumbled for his phone in his pocket, his pulse pounding in his ears. He pressed the power button. Nothing. The screen remained dark.
Dead.
Then a noise. A low, sickening creak, like something shifting against the floorboards. Daniel's body tensed. His eyes adjusted to the faint sliver of moonlight spilling through the window. His stomach twisted. Baxter was gone. The spot where the dog had been sitting was empty now, just an imprint on the carpet, damp and dark. Daniel's breath hitched.
How?
Then footsteps. Not paws. Footsteps.
Slow.
Deliberate. Coming toward him. Daniel's body locked up. He backed away, his heel hitting the dresser behind him. The wood groaned under his weight. His fingers gripped the edge, white-knuckled. Another step. Then another. The air grew thick, suffocating. The stench of damp fur, of rot, filled his nostrils. A whisper slithered through the dark. You left me. Daniel's chest clenched. His shaking hand reached for the lamp beside his bed. He fumbled for the switch, his breath caught in his throat. His fingers found the knob. Light flooded the room. And for a split second he saw it. A figure stood in the corner. It was Baxter, but not Baxter. His body was twisted, stretched too tall, his limbs wrong. His blind eyes were wide, clouded, staring directly at Daniel. His mouth hung open, not in a pant, but in a grotesque, slack-jawed gape. And then it moved.
Fast.
Daniel didn't think. He bolted. He lunged for the door, ripping it open. His feet barely touched the floor as he stumbled into the hallway.
Click. Click. Click.
The sound of nails, no, fingers, skittering across the floor behind him.
He ran.
The walls around him blurred, the hallway stretching longer than it should. His breaths came in ragged gasps as he reached the front door. His shaking hands fumbled with the lock. Behind him, scraping. A low, guttural sound, half growl, half breath. He didn't turn around. His fingers finally found the lock, twisted it, ripped the door open. The cold night air hit his face as he stumbled outside. The porch light flickered overhead, buzzing like a dying insect. His lungs burned as he sprinted across the yard. Then he heard it. The footsteps. Not behind him. Beside him.
Keeping pace.
He turned his head and nearly collapsed. A shadow moved alongside him, tall, inhuman. Its form flickered in and out of existence, there and not there, shifting with the wind. Its head tilted toward him, though it had no discernible features, just a void where a face should be. Daniel choked back a scream. He pushed harder, his feet pounding against the pavement.
His car.
It was only a few feet away. He lunged forward, wrenching the door open. His hands shook as he slammed it shut, locking it. His breath came in sharp, shallow bursts as he fumbled for the keys, jammed them into the ignition, twisted. The engine roared to life. He didn't hesitate. He threw the car into reverse, tires screeching against the asphalt as he backed out of the driveway. The streetlights cast flickering shadows across the pavement. His hands clenched the wheel as he sped down the road, his heart a thunderous drum in his chest. It was over. It had to be over. But then, a chill crept up his spine. A feeling that he wasn't alone. Slowly, hesitantly, he glanced at the rearview mirror, and his stomach dropped.
There.
Sitting in the back seat. A shape.
A dog.
Or something wearing the skin of a dog. Its mouth curled into a grotesque, almost human smile. And then, it whispered, "You left me." The lights along the road flickered and died. The car skidded, and everything went black. Daniel woke to silence. His body was slumped against the steering wheel, the car engine dead. The only light came from the pale glow of the moon, filtering through the windshield. His head throbbed, a sharp, pulsing ache behind his eyes. What happened? His breath was shallow, his chest tight. He lifted his head slowly, wincing at the stiffness in his neck. His fingers gripped the wheel, slick with sweat. Then he remembered. The whisper. The thing in the back seat. His stomach twisted. He had to look. With painstaking slowness, his eyes flicked to the rear-view mirror. Empty. The back seat was bare. No twisted, smiling thing. No shadow. For a brief moment, relief washed over him. Then,
Tap, tap, tap. A sound.
coming from the window, Daniel's heart stopped. The car was still, surrounded by an expanse of darkness. There were no streetlights, no signs of where he was. The road should have led straight out of town, but now it stretched endlessly into shadow.
He wasn't where he was supposed to be.
And something was outside the car. His fingers hovered over the door lock. His breath hitched as he turned his head toward the window. A shape stood just beyond the glass.
A dog. Baxter.
He sat motionless on the pavement, head tilted, ears perked, as if waiting. His blind eyes stared directly at Daniel.
No.
Not at him. Through him. A lump formed in Daniel's throat. His fingers twitched toward the ignition, but the key refused to turn.
Tap.
The sound came again, but Baxter hadn't moved. Daniel's breath hitched. His pulse pounded in his ears. The tap came again. From the other side, his head turned slowly, and his stomach dropped. Another Baxter. Identical. Sitting by the passenger window. Blind eyes. Tilted head. Waiting. Daniel's skin crawled.
No.
That wasn't possible. He had seen Baxter outside his window, but now he was on the other side, too. Another tap. Daniel's breathing turned ragged. He looked through the windshield, and his entire body locked up. There were dozens of them, all identical, all Baxter, lined up in the darkness.
Sitting.
Watching. Waiting. Their heads tilted in eerie unison. Daniel's throat closed. His body screamed at him to move, but he was trapped. Then one of them stood up. Its body moved wrong, limbs jerking unnaturally as it took a step forward. Then another, and another, until it was at his window. Daniel pressed his back against the seat. His breath hitched in his throat. Then the mouth opened.
Wide.
Too wide. And a voice, his own voice, whispered, "You left me." The car shook violently. Daniel screamed. He twisted the keys frantically, begging the car to start. The things outside pressed against the glass. Their mouths stretched into unnatural grins. The air grew thick, suffocating. Daniel's vision blurred. And then, silence. The figures were gone. The road was empty. The night was still. Daniel's breath came in sharp, ragged bursts. His fingers trembled as he touched the window. Nothing. Just his own reflection, pale and drenched in sweat. His chest heaved. He didn't understand. Then something cold touched his neck. A whisper, right against his ear. "You left me." Daniel's body locked. He felt it behind him, sitting in the back seat, breathing. The car light flickered. And, before he could react, hands wrapped around his throat. Daniel thrashed against the unseen grip tightening around his throat. His fingers clawed at the air, desperate to break free. His lungs burned, his vision blurring as his body convulsed against the driver's seat. The whisper came again, soft, cold, pressing against his ear like an exhale from the grave. "You left me." His chest seized. The world around him faded, the dark swallowing everything whole. Then, the grip loosened. Air rushed into his lungs as he gasped, collapsing forward against the steering wheel. His body shook violently, his fingers gripping the wheel in a death hold. His entire frame was drenched in sweat, his pulse pounding in his ears. The car was silent. The figures were gone. For a long moment, Daniel just sat there, panting, trying to make sense of what had happened. His fingers trembled as he reached for the ignition again, barely able to grip the key. It turned. The engine rumbled to life, headlights piercing through the darkness. He didn't waste a second. He threw the car into drive and sped forward, the tires screeching against the pavement. He didn't know where he was. Didn't care. He just needed to get away. The road stretched before him, an endless void of night. His eyes flickered to the rearview mirror every few seconds, expecting to see it again. That thing, that presence sitting in the back seat. But there was nothing. The silence was worse. His breath remained unsteady, the weight of something unseen pressing against his chest. The rhythmic hum of the tires against the road did little to calm him. And then, the radio crackled. A static-filled hiss, soft at first, then growing louder. Daniel's fingers clenched around the wheel, his knuckles white. He hadn't touched the radio. He reached out, hesitantly twisting the dial to turn it off. It didn't stop. Instead, a voice broke through the static. A voice he knew. His own. "You left me." Daniel's blood turned to ice. The voice on the radio was distorted, stretched in an unnatural, haunting mimicry of his own. He slammed his fist against the dial, twisting it furiously. The static grew louder, the voice warping, echoing inside the car. Then the headlights flickered. His stomach twisted as he pressed harder on the gas. The trees along the roadside blurred into shadows, twisting in unnatural angles, their branches stretching toward him like skeletal fingers. He needed to wake up. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. Then his headlights caught something in the distance. A shape, standing in the middle of the road. His heart slammed against his ribs as he wrenched the wheel. The tires screamed against the pavement as the car skidded. His body jolted sideways, the seatbelt digging into his ribs. The car spun out of control. For a split second, just before impact, his eyes locked onto the figure standing in the road. And his breath stopped. It was Baxter. Or what was left of him. Mangled. Hollow-eyed. Mouth twisted into an unnatural, human-like grin. Then, darkness. Daniel woke to the sound of rain. His eyes fluttered open, his body aching as if he had been crushed under 1,000 pounds. His fingers twitched against wet earth. His clothes were damp. He wasn't in his car. Slowly, painfully, he lifted his head. His breath caught in his throat. He was back in the forest, the same place where he had left Baxter. The trees loomed overhead, their twisted branches stretching across the sky. The air was thick, suffocating. A deep, aching cold settled into his bones. His car was gone. The road was gone. There was nothing but the trees and the silence. Then a rustling sound. Daniel's breath hitched. His head snapped toward the noise. And his heart stopped. Baxter. Sitting in the distance, his blind eyes locked onto Daniel. His body shook as he slowly pushed himself upright. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. Baxter's head tilted. His mouth opened, wide, too wide. And then he moved. Not walked. Dragged. His limbs twisted and cracked as he skittered forward, his body jerking unnaturally, like something learning how to move for the first time. Daniel's pulse roared in his ears. He stumbled backward. Then a voice. Soft. Hollow. Inhuman. "You left me." Daniel turned to run. The whisper followed. And the last thing he heard before the darkness swallowed him whole was the sound of clicking nails against the forest floor. The sound of something coming home.